Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Environment and Energy, as you can see on the screen. And just to make sure that you're all in the right place, this webinar is an ISO 50001-2018 Transitions Essential webinar. NQA is one of the UK's major certification bodies and we're represented in a number of locations across the world, and you can see on the screen there a number of our particular key clients. Skip through the corporate stuff. So this webinar then, we're here to look at the changes and offer some guidance to the fairly newly issued now, August last year, version of ISO 50001-2018, the Energy Management Standard. So what are we going to be doing? I'm going to talk for about 45-50 minutes, and then there'll be a section at the end if anybody has any questions. If you've ever sat through one of my webinars before, you'll probably find that we get a bit pushed for time towards the end because I do like to talk, unfortunately. There's no need to take frantic notes. Everybody who's registered for this webinar will receive a copy of the slides in PDF format, and also a link to a recording of this webinar which will be placed on our YouTube channel. So there's no need to write everything down, there's no need to worry if you've missed anything, because you will be able to listen again. If anybody has any questions, if you've been through any of these webinars before, you'll possibly know that you type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. That's where it should be. Might be on the left, depends how your screen's set up. But you should have a dialog box, and in there should be either chat or questions. I think either of those will actually get through to me. If it's a question relevant to where we are at the time, I shall endeavour to answer it there and then. If not, we'll leave them to the end. I'm not precious about finishing bang on 2 o'clock. Previous webinars I've done have maybe run over by 5 or 10 minutes. Depends on the number of questions. If you do need to leave at any point, don't worry. As I say, you'll get a copy of the recording. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at. The new concepts, a reminder of how the standard's laid out. Looking at the clauses, that's going to be the main part of the presentation. A little bit about the transition process, the NQA transition process. I see that not everybody that's logged in is an NQA client, and that's fine. These are available open to anybody at all, and recognise a number of the names on there. So if I have met you before, hello, and you're more than welcome, obviously. Right, so that's the plan. Hopefully by the time we've finished, these are the things that you will have a better understanding of. So the key concepts of 50001, a look at some new terminology and some important definitions that have been introduced by ISO 50001-2018. Obviously the specific clauses, predominantly the new clauses. We will look at every clause, but we'll spend a little bit longer on some clauses than others. Look at the transition timeline, some notable dates, and then a little bit at the end on how I think you might be best prepared to get ready for the changes. So there are some overarching concepts in this standard that are fairly similar to any of the standards, any of the new standards, ISO 9001, 14001, the new health and safety standard, 45001. A lot of the new standards that are in what we call the Annex SL format, and we'll look at that in a short while, all these standards have an intended outcome. And the intended outcome for this standard is continual improvement in energy performance. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that if this was 9001, it would be continual improvement in quality performance, 14001 environmental performance, and so on. So that's the main intended outcome, continual improvement in energy performance. Fulfillment of compliance obligations is another key intended outcome, and then the achievement of any set energy objectives. So those are the main things that we as an assessment body would expect to see by some organisation that has implemented this standard. As with all of the new standards also, they particularly look as well at the management of change. And there's a much greater focus, much greater emphasis in this standard on the planning process itself. Whereas maybe the old standard just asked you to look at doing something, the new standard now has a section where you actually have to plan what you're going to do. And maybe monitoring and measurement is a good example of that. There is now a clause in the standard on planning for monitoring and measurement, data collection, and then a bit later on in the standard there is a clause all about actually carrying that out. And of course this standard, because of its structure, is designed now to be more or less, and I use that term deliberately and we'll see why shortly, fully integrated with any other standards that are in that set, what we call the Annex SL format. So energy management standards, management system standards, have been around for pushing on for what, 17, 18 years now. My first involvement really was about 10 years ago now, in 2009, with BSEN, British Standard 16001, which was really the first modern energy management standard that we would recognise as being in the same format as 9001, 14001 and so on. That only lasted a couple of years before it was superseded internationally by the old version now of ISO 50001 2011, which is now superseded by the 2018 version. I understand there's a slight, and I forgot to change it before we started the webinar, the expiry date that you see on the right hand side of the screen should actually now say the 22nd of August. That's been clarified by UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So actually I should have made a change to that, but if you just want to make a note, the certificate expiry date for old standards is the 22nd of August 2021. But that's the development of the development timeline for the new standard, starting on the left hand side with the standard originally issued in 2011, draft versions of the new standard, and then late August last year the new standard itself was published, and there is a 3-year transition process. And as I say, if you haven't transitioned by the 3rd anniversary in August 2021, then your certificate will automatically expire. So what we're now in the middle of is this NQA transition program, as you can see there, that we've trained all our staff. We have commenced a series of webinars like this where we're providing guidance and support to clients, and indeed other people who are not clients. We might hope that you might become clients one day, but that's not really the reason for doing this. And then we will be ready to start carrying out audits to this new standard. We had yesterday, funnily enough, our UCAS accreditation visit and received a clean bill of health, and are just waiting for the final approval from UCAS. And then we, along with probably about the same time as all the other certification bodies, will be open for business to start carrying out audits to the new standard. So why do we need to change standards? We get people asking us, why are you making all these changes? Why are you changing what we need to do? Why all of this? It's none of our making. Obviously, the International Standards Organization decide that there are requirements to change standards. Quite often, it's to make sure that they remain relevant. They remain relevant to industry and to the other organizations who use them. This standard, it's what, 8 years since the previous version was issued, and it's expected that this version is probably going to be around for another 7, 8, maybe up to 10 years. And it's to provide a consistent foundation across all the different types of standards in terms of implementing management systems. Obviously, 10 years ago, things were slightly different to they are now. The world we live in, the management systems we have to implement, the way we run our businesses becomes increasingly complex, and standards need to evolve in order to reflect the complexity of the world in which we live in. One of the other criticisms sometimes of the early versions of some of these standards was that they read fine if you were a manufacturing organisation. If you were in the service sector, they weren't quite as easy, or they didn't quite read the same, and therefore all of the standards are being made more applicable to every type of organisation, whether you're a manufacturing organisation, whether you're in the service sector, whatever sector you're in. The standards have also got a greater emphasis on corporate governance. There is a new clause in all of these standards, and 50,118 is no different. There is a key focus on leadership, focus on corporate governance rather, and the role of senior management, the role of the MD is as a much greater influence on the standard itself. And ultimately, all of these standards are set out so that there is easier integration of all of the systems. They follow the Annex SL format, and there is a but, and I've put that in deliberately because unfortunately this standard has slightly strayed away from that Annex SL format, and I'll point out the changes as we go through the standard. So I was just looking. Yeah, good question. Our external auditor, another certification body, not NQA, I won't say which one, are stopping completing surveillance audits against the 2011 version from January, February 2020. Are NQA doing the same? No, we're not. What we will be doing from January, February 2020, anybody coming along for a new certification. So if you're coming along wanting a stage 1 after January, February 2020, that will have to be to the new standard. But that certification body you mentioned is doing that of their own volition. That's not a requirement from UCAS. We are not doing that. We will be continuing to do surveillance visits to the old standard, probably up to at least another 12 months after that, probably to early 2021. Obviously, once you get to the last 4 or 5 months of the transition period, we'll have stopped doing them by then. I can tell you why they're doing it. We at NQA were the best performing certification body in getting people transitioned. And what LRQA, and I've said who they are now, what they're trying to do is make sure that they don't have a hump towards the end of the transition period. A lot of certification bodies hadn't planned ahead effectively. We did, and we managed to get all bar a very, very small handful, which wasn't our fault, it was the client's fault. We got everybody transitioned that actually wanted to be transitioned in time, and I don't think other certification bodies were quite as successful. So that's why they will be doing that, to learn the lessons, to learn from the mistakes that they made previously. So that's the clause, that's Annex SL, that's what it looks like. If you've got 9001, if you've got 14,001 in place, you'll recognise that already. And of course, those clauses 4 to 10 are the auditable clauses, and those are the clauses we will be looking at as we go through today. That's taken from the standard. That's the clauses set against the PlanDoCheckAct, the Deming cycle. If you've got a background in quality, that's what it's known as, PlanDoCheckAct. And that's how I don't know why, I tend to prefer things in a linear fashion, and that's a document that I drew up. I see it replicated in a number of places now, so clearly people like that also. People have used that. I'm quite happy if people want to pinch that. And that's the standard basically. PlanDoCheckAct across the top left-hand corner, the 3 non-auditable clauses, and then in blue, green, on my computer it's a sort of salmon pink, and then purple, the PlanDoCheckAct, and the sub clauses that come out underneath that. As I said, it's all about integration, and we have a number of clients that have that full model with a fully integrated management system now, And in a number of cases, people already have their 50,001 system meeting the requirements of that standard, because, as I say, all they've done really is take the old standard and fit it into the Annex SL format. So we have a number of clients that already operate that model, and I'm sure over the next couple of years there will be an increasing number. So it fits together with 14,001 very nicely. I must admit, when I first saw energy management systems being written back in 2009 with 16,001, my first thought was, well, why would you need a separate energy management system? Because surely if energy is an issue within your business, it would be covered by your aspects and impacts evaluation. And therefore, 14,001, of course, addresses all significant environmental impacts. So why wouldn't you do that? Just quickly, another question. I did mention this right at the start. You might have come in just after we started. Yes, everybody's going to get a copy of the slides. Everybody's also going to get a link to a recording of this webinar, so you'll be able to listen again if there's anything that I say that you want to go back and re-examine. So yes, you'll get a copy of the slides, and you'll get a link to a YouTube link to a recording of this webinar. So yes, so 50,001, what it does, it takes the principles of energy management, energy performance improvement, and takes them, if you like, to a slightly higher level than 14,000 would do in its own right. Obviously, both standards can be implemented individually, or, as most of our clients are, they're fully integrated with other management standards, 9 and 45 as well. But if energy is an organisation's most significant impact, then 50,001 might be the more appropriate standard. And we do have a number of clients that say have 9,001 for quality, have ignored 14, and have then just gone forward with 50,001 for energy management. As it says at the bottom, it takes the principles of energy management to a much higher level. But ultimately, 14 and 9 don't compete with it. Sorry, 14 and 50,001 don't compete with each other. They do work hand in hand and complement each other. Couple of terms of definitions that we need to just make sure that we all understand. Again, if you've got the other standards in place, this will be old hat to you now. The standard defines correction as the action to eliminate a detected non-conformity. It details corrective action now as action to eliminate the cause of a detected non-conformity. So correction and corrective action are similar but not the same. Preventive action as a term, as per all the other standards, now has been dropped, so that term is no longer there. I do have clients, and we do have clients within NQA that have retained that term, preventive action, and the standard's quite clear. You can call things whatever you like, and if you want to call something preventive action, then you can do, but the standard really is now saying that clause 6, which is all about risks and opportunities and identification of those, and then moving forward into operational control in terms of mitigating the impacts of those risks and indeed grasping those opportunities, that in itself is deemed to be the preventive action. And then finally, a key measure, we've talked about the fact that the standard requires improvements in energy performance. Well, what is energy performance? And the standard says it's measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption. So after all of that, 16 minutes in, let's get started now on the main 7 auditable clauses. So if you've got 9,001, 45,001, 14,001, you will have seen this before. Basically, what this is asking, what this is reminding us of, is context of the organisation, and we have to determine the issues that are relevant to what we do, relevant to our purpose, that affect our organisation's ability to achieve the intended outcome. Now, if you remember, cast your minds back a few minutes, the intended outcome of this standard predominantly is the improvement of energy performance. And put simply, what this clause is all about is identifying things that are going to help us. So there's a lot of things we're doing that are going to help us achieve that expected outcome. There's also things that are going to affect our ability to do that, things that might get in the way. And it's as simple as the standard is all about taking the things that are going to help us and maximising that help, if you like, they're the opportunities, then taking the things that are going to get in the way and minimizing the impact of those, mitigating the impact of those negatives. So that's where the opportunities and the risk comes in, and that's where context is important. It's, if you like, it's the foundations of this standard. If you've got, as I say, one of the other standards in place, you'll already have done this, and it might only need tweaking just to make sure that you've covered all energy related activities. But the requirement is to consider the organization's context and needs of interested parties. Come on to that in a short while. And if we do this properly, it makes sure that our ENMS, Energy Management System, focuses on, as I've said, those issues that present the greatest risk, and risk can be either positive or negative, so risks and opportunities, to achieving energy performance improvement. Not going to go through this slide in detail. People always say, well, what sort of things should we be thinking about? The standard doesn't say how you have to do it. This is the way I tend to look at it, that you've got energy related issues, you've got external issues, and you've got internal issues. You can do it how you like. Some people do SWOT analysis, some people do what's called a pestle analysis, where you're looking at political, economic, social, technological, and so on. But you can do it how you like. All the standard says is you have to do it. But don't forget, the intent of all of this is to provide a high-level conceptual understanding of what these important issues are. And that's all this clause is all about. Now, I've put the phrase high level in bold because one of the clauses of the standard is leadership. And quite often now, when I'm sat down with a company's leader, be it the managing director, be it a chairman, whoever it might be, I quite often now quiz them a little bit about what these potential key issues are, because a high level understanding, I would expect those people, if you're running a business, I'd expect you to have a conceptual understanding of the important issues that can affect your business, particularly in this instance from an energy issue. So interested parties. So again, builds on the context, and those are the issues. So we need to think about for interested parties who they are and what expectations they have from us in this instance in related to energy management. Now, this is one of the key areas where the new standard has drifted away from the Annex SL format. So if you've got 14001 particularly, clause 6.1.3 of ISO 14001, so that comes under the planning clause 613. That clause is all about, under the old terminology, legal and other requirements, under the new terminology, compliance obligations. Now, for some reason, the writers of this standard did not decide to stick with that same format. I wish they had. It would have made life much simpler. They had a clause in 14,001 they could have just lifted straight across, and it would have made sense because it was just moving across and looking at the energy compliance obligations. However, they've decided to move that across into interested parties. So there isn't a clause on compliance obligations, there isn't a clause on legislation, it's tucked away under interested parties, and it's saying that you have to evaluate at this point what interested parties, and interested parties would be the regulator in this case, the Environment Agency, if you're in the UK particularly, could be other bodies as well, SEPA if you're in Scotland, the NIA, Northern Ireland and so on, what the regulators would have an interest in. And the standard also stuck with the term legal and other requirements, whereas the other Annex SL standards have used compliance obligations. However, if you've got 14,001, if you've got a compliance register, if you're using that format for 14 and you're worried that you might have to change that just for 50, don't be. We won't be making an issue of that, so long as it's covered. It doesn't matter whether you cover it under clause 4.2 or clause 6.13. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that you have covered it. And then with the needs of interested parties, you have the option to decide, other than the legal issues, obviously, you can decide which of the needs of interested parties you choose to comply with. skip over this. Who are they? You can see who they are. We've seen slides like this many, many times. Employees, board members, customers, and so on. The scope of the EMS, you can select part or a whole of the organisation. And this is the same as with other standards. However, two important points I would wish to make here. If you're going to draw the boundaries of your scope around, say, a part of your organisation, you're going to exclude a part of your organisation, you can't do that purely to exclude an energy type. So you couldn't say across an organisation, well, we'll ignore this site because this site's still using coal. And we don't really want to include coal, so we'll draw that out because we're going to ignore that bit. You can't do that. If you're going to exclude somewhere, you can't exclude it because it's got a particular energy type. And the scope that you do pick must be representative of all the different energy types used across the organisation, be that gas, be that electricity, oil-based fuels, renewables, whatever it is. The scope must reflect every type of energy that you use. One that's causing a little bit of question, I've had a number of my existing clients ask me about this. The standard says you must have the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use and energy consumption within the scope of your site. I've had a number of smaller organisations who have 50,001 currently and have said, well, actually the offices that we're in, we don't get gas bills, we don't get electricity bills, we pay a rent to the landlord and the landlord includes all our energy usage within the bill. We don't know how much we're using. We can't make any changes to what we do. Yes, we can switch lights on and off and we can alter the thermostat within some set parameters. And other than that, that's about all we can do. Does that give you the authority to control energy efficiency, energy usage, energy consumption within your scope? It's a difficult one, and it's one that I don't have an answer to, if I'm honest. What we're tending to say is we'll take every case on a case-by-case basis. But so far, we've always managed to find an angle. When people have asked the question, we've been able to find an angle. Even if it is, well, we can turn the lights off if it's bright. That is giving you the opportunity to control your energy use and energy consumption. So I think we're okay with that. If anybody does have any significant issues on that, anybody wishes to pick our brains, I'll give my details at the end, but you can always email me. It's richard.walsh@nqa.com, and I'm happy to answer individual questions if anybody's particularly perturbed by the thought of that particular requirement. And then finally, the scope and boundaries must be made available as documented information. Now, one other thing I point out at this point, some people use ISO 50001 as a way of complying with ESOS. That's the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. That's a 4-year program, and the next reporting deadline is the 5th of December this year. So if you have an ESOS obligation and you are 50,001 registered with a UCAS certification body, and I stress that, a UCAS, not anybody else, a UCAS certification body, then that 50,001 certificate will be sufficient to discharge those obligations, providing that the scope of the 50,001 certification includes at least 90% of your total energy use. So ESOS has a 10% de minimis where you can ignore up to 10% of your energy usage because maybe that's too small collectively to log, or it's not worth the effort to log. So it has a 90% minimum, if you like. You've got to count for 90% of your energy use. If you're using 50,001 for that purpose, your 50,001 scope must cover 90% of the total energy usage of the organisation. Clause 4.4, energy management systems. This is the system itself. You have to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve your energy management system. And that's a new requirement of all the Annex SL standards. You have to continually improve them to make sure you achieve the intended outcomes, as we talked about earlier. You've got to make sure that your processes are controlled, they're carried out as you intend them to be carried out, and to make sure that they achieve the desired results. Are your processes achieving what you want them to achieve? You've got to define how your processes interact and make sure that the ENMS, the energy management system, can be, and indeed is, integrated into wider business processes. Now that could be design and development, could be procurement, could be HR, sales, marketing, manufacturing, whatever. And also when you're setting up, if you're setting up a system from scratch, then obviously the knowledge you gained in clauses 4.1 and 4.2, that's context and interested parties, that has to be taken into account. As I said earlier, that forms the foundations for the whole system. Leadership and commitment. So this is a new clause required by Annex SL. So again, 9 and 14 have had this clause in for since 2015. If you've got a standalone energy management system, this might be new. So it's all about the senior leadership, the top management. I don't like that phrase, but that's a phrase the standard uses. The top management of the organisation, making sure that they have ownership of the energy management system, and making sure. And I think this top bullet point is a key one. It's not managed in isolation or separately from the core strategy of the business. So in other words, is the business taking us in one direction, but the energy management system is trying to pull us in a completely separate direction? That's not allowed. Also, that in this instance, energy management, but it could be quality or health and safety or environment, is considered when strategic business decisions are made. So again, it's about senior executives within businesses, I guess, walking the walk and not just talking the talk. So therefore, use the standard for what it's meant to be used for. It's a planning tool. It can help businesses make decisions and collect the information needed and justify the business decisions. It needs to be aligned with business objectives, so therefore the energy objectives, environmental objectives, quality objectives, health and safety objectives have to be aligned with the business objectives. Has to be properly resourced. Now that's clause 7.1 is resourced, but again, we will be looking at resources in a while, but I actually think that resources tend to be provided by the top management, so therefore I tend to cover resources under leadership. I've got another question which I'll come to when we get to that bit, which is, does continual improve mean against your baseline or year on year? I'll come back to that when we get to the relevant point, if that's okay. Right, so where were we? Resources, yes. Receives the appropriate involvement from across the business. So again, it's something that's everybody's responsibility. It's not just the energy team. Senior management have to promote continual improvement, both in energy efficiency and in the system itself, and to make sure that the performance indicators, that's the first time we see one of these three-letter acronyms, if you like, ENPIs. I guess, don't tell me there's 4 letters in it. So energy performance indicators, and they need to appropriately represent our energy performance. So that's who top management are, person or group of people who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. And ultimately, top management now take the accountability for the effectiveness of the energy management system. If you are only implementing this standard at, say, one site, a particular, I don't know, manufacturing site that may have a particularly heavy energy usage, but not the rest of the organisation, top management within the scope of the system there would actually be the senior person at that site, not necessarily the senior person that might sit in a boardroom 100 miles away. That's what we mean by the second bullet point, or the middle bullet point on that slide. As with all the standards, we have to have a policy, we have to have an energy policy. Again, I've seen policies where companies now have a combined energy and environment policy. That's quite acceptable, so long as it meets the requirements of both standards. It has to be appropriate to what you do. You can't just pinch somebody else's, so you can't just use that and copy and paste. It has to be relevant to you. I always like to think I could read somebody's policy in isolation and then just look at or have an idea as to what sector they're in. So the policy would perhaps introduce who they are. I'll skip that next question from Derek just short. I'll come back to that. But question about, can I give a quick example of a process interaction? Well, energy processes very rarely work in isolation. And it may be that the amount of energy that's used for one particular part of our process may have an impact on how another part of the process works. So for instance, an example from a client I've worked with in the past, whereby they are in the wool industry and they are washing wool, if you like, and the wool at the end of the process has a moisture content after it's been dried, and the moisture content, the drying method, will have an impact on the energy usage. The client needs the wool, the more energy that's used. However, the way that is then processed further down the line will affect how processes move on. So therefore, we can't just look at energy processes in isolation. We need to look to see where there is linkages. Just as you would with any sort of process flow diagram, sometimes the energy that's used in one part of the business can be used elsewhere. So it's really trying to get away from this view that we just look at something, we look at a machine in isolation, we look at a process in our factory in isolation. We need to think about how that can interact with other energy using processes within the business. Okay, so the policy, appropriate to what you do, it's got to set or have a framework for setting energy objectives and targets. Interestingly, the standard still uses the term target. It's the only one, I think, now. The other standards have dropped that term, but this standard still uses targets. It's got to commit to ensure the availability of information and resources to achieve the objectives and targets. So you're going to make sure, and we need to see that stated in there, that you're going to give people the information, the tools, the techniques, and the resources needed to achieve those objectives. There has to be a statement that you commit to satisfy applicable legal and other requirements. If you want to use the term compliance obligations, yes, you can. There has to be a commitment. This is the one that I see missing most often. There has to be a commitment to continual improvement, but the one that's missing quite often is continual improvement of the system itself. That would get you a non-conformance if it didn't state that. So there's two types of continual improvement, energy performance, which you'll look at in a minute, and that'll answer one of the questions I've got hanging up my sleeve, and also continual improvement of the system itself. It's got to support design and procurement for energy efficiency. It's got to be documented, available to interested parties. That's quite acceptable to be interested parties by request, and communicated internally. Roles, responsibilities have to be assigned and communicated across the organisation. There is no requirement now for an energy manager. That was a requirement in the old standard. The requirement has gone, just as the same way that 9001 doesn't require a quality manager, 14 doesn't require an environmental manager. However, there now is a requirement, a formal requirement for an energy team. Now, I did get asked the question, could you have a team of one? And okay, there's a joke, isn't there, that there's no I in team. However, I'm not sure. Yes, according to the letter of the standard, I guess you could have an energy team of one, but it's getting away from the intention. The intention is, with all of these standards, that it's not just one person's responsibility. And an energy team, we would expect key people within the organisation to be involved in the energy management system. Maybe the manufacturing manager, maybe a maintenance manager should also be involved in that energy management process. But we have to define key roles, and we have to make sure that we establish the resources. And as I say, I've pulled that clause from 7.1 because I think allocation of resources sits better here. I said earlier that the standard's much more related to planning. Yes, it is. We need to plan to address the issues within the system and to make sure that the system achieves its intended outcome. And I've listed again what they are there. And we need to prevent or reduce undesirable effects, if you like. So if you said right at the start, the context is all about maximising the positives and minimising the negatives. That's what this is starting to get us to think about now. So how can we do that? How can we think about sitting down and working out a plan to make sure that we do maximise those opportunities, and more importantly, probably at this stage, minimise or prevent, if we can, the undesirable effects. But ultimately, it is all about achieving continual improvement. And that's what the standard says. So we have to plan actions to address those identified risks and opportunities, and we have to make sure that those actions are integrated into our management system and into our energy performance processes, and we have to evaluate ultimately the effectiveness of those actions. A policy commitment is that we will have energy objectives with targets, and as I say, the word target has been maintained by this standard, although a lot of my environmental clients use the term target still, because we understand what we mean by that. But it's a policy commitment that there are objectives and targets, and part of those targets are the improvement of their management system and also continual improvement of energy performance. And again, it tells you there the objectives have to be consistent with our policy, they have to be measurable if they can. Consider the significant energy uses. Significant energy uses are the energy version of significant aspects. In 14,001, we have to monitor our objectives. How are we achieving them? Are we on track? We have to communicate our progress, communicate where we are. We have to document them, document our progress, and then we have to update them if things change. And for each objective, as with the other standards now, there needs to be a plan. There needs to be planned actions, who, what, when. What resources do we require to achieve them? How are we going to evaluate the results? Picking some indicators if we need to. Those are the energy performance indicators. And again, we need to make sure if we need to, that the method of achieving these objectives is integrated into our wider business processes. Energy review is a mandatory requirement of the standard. It's not changed really from the old standard. There's one extra little bit that's been moved in from the management review, which is the final bullet point on this slide, which is to estimate future energy use and energy consumption. That used to be in the management review. Is it acceptable to have one target? Somebody's just asked me. Yes. But I would want to see what that target was. If you're a really big organisation and your target's just to turn your lights off when you don't need them, that might not be a big enough target. I would want to see what that target was, and it may be that target could be broken down into a number of sub-targets, if you like. But yeah, the standard doesn't say how many targets you have to have. I think one being the absolute minimum, but it probably is. Or target, I'm assuming if you said, is it acceptable to have one target? And then the next question is target or objective. I assume you mean both. Yes, absolutely. One would do, but I would, as an assessor, I would want to have a look at that and just see whether that one is significant enough to be able to say, yes, if something's so big that we're going to spend all our time doing that, that's fine. But if it's only one and it's fairly inconsequential, I would perhaps be trying to give you a nudge to try and look at something else. So energy review then, it's all about analysing our energy usage. So where are we using energy, how are we using energy, and how are we consuming it? And it's about identifying the different types of energy that we use, be that gas, be that electricity, be that oil-based fuels, etc., etc. And we're looking at past and current energy use and consumption. And again, the standard doesn't tell us how we do this, but it's all about, as with 14,001, which looks at identifying aspects and then asks you to identify what the significant ones are. The review is all about identifying your significant energy uses. Now, significant energy uses are going to be a numerical value. So what processes, what elements of the business, what is it that you're using, or where are you using energy, and how much are you using? How much are you using? And that's usually the analysis. Once you've identified these significant energy uses, for each one of them, you have to determine what are the relevant variables. So, for instance, if your significant energy use is maybe an oven in a large work, so it's a large gas-fired oven, what are the variables? So what is it about that oven that decides, or how do you decide how much energy you use? Is it temperature related? Is it work related? do different products that go through that oven affect the amount of energy. Some need a higher temperature than others. So you need to determine what the current variables are. You need to determine how are you currently managing it, how is it currently performing, and then identify those individuals, so those people who work under your control. So it could be the people who are responsible for programming the timers, programming the settings, people who may be process engineers, whoever that might be, that can affect or influence the energy performance. And you need to go through those three things for each of the significant energy uses. And by doing that, that allows us to determine and prioritize opportunities for improving our energy performance. And that's the underlining requirement of this. And then, as I say, something that's been brought in from the management review in the new standard, it's in this bit. In the old standard, it was under management review. You also then have to think about these processes and look at moving forward how much energy or what their energy performance is likely to be. So the review has to be updated at defined intervals, as well as in response to what the standard calls major changes to static factors. Now, static factors are things that don't change. So we've talked about the variables that might change, that you alter the temperature settings on this oven, the amount of work going through it might alter whether it's switched on or switched off. Those are not static factors. The static factors are, for instance, the type of oven itself, the type of burners that you've got. They are things that wouldn't necessarily change. However, it may be that you decide to upgrade your burners on your oven. That will be a change to the static factors, and that might then involve an updating of your energy review, because hopefully by changing the burners, you've gone to something that's slightly more efficient, and therefore you are starting to show an energy performance improvement, and that would need to be reflected in the energy review. Static factors could also be, at the moment I see a lot of people who are taking out their old lighting, putting in LED lighting. That's a change to a static factor. Static factors tend to be fixtures and fittings, things that generally don't move or don't vary. You have to maintain as documented information the methods and the criteria used to develop the review. So in other words, how you've done it, or how you go about doing it, how you've done it, and then retain documented information of the results. Performance indicators, we need to select performance indicators. Performance indicators are a measure. I tend to like to think of them as a ruler, a measuring tool that can be used to compare energy performance before and after the implementation of action plans. And performance indicators are not absolute figures. So the amount of energy you've used in March, taken from your energy bill, is not a performance indicator. Performance indicators tend to be then an amount of energy judged against a variable criteria. So it could be amount of energy used per widget that you produce, or amount of energy used per head of staff, or amount of energy per £1,000 of sales, something like that. They tend to be the performance indicators. Again, they have to be appropriate, and that's a judgment that we will make with you as to whether those performance indicators are appropriate. They have to be able to demonstrate energy performance improvement. Can an SEU be a certain building? Not really. I would want the SEU, or significant energy use could be a certain building, yes. I work with a very large university in the northeast, and they have broken their energy usage down into I think it's currently 170 odd buildings. And what they've done is they've looked at energy use for all 170 odd buildings, and then put them into a spreadsheet in descending order, and then taken the top 80% of the energy usage. And funnily enough, the top 80% is approximately 20% of the buildings. So therefore, they've taken those top 20 buildings or top 20% of the buildings, should I say, as their significant energy uses, because they use 80% roughly of the energy. So yes, you could. That's quite acceptable. So EMPR values have to be determined. You have to set out a method to show how you've decided what they're going to be, to show what the criteria is, and you must maintain them as documented information. And one of the things we wish to look at when we come in an audit is what those are. We then have to set a baseline. And a baseline is a set year. So for instance, we might take, say, 2016 as a baseline, and it's what were we doing in 2016. And that's, if you like, a set point in time to show that this is where our performance was. Now, again, the standard doesn't say how long the baseline has to cover, but generally it's accepted to be a 12-month period, because we need to be able to cover all of the variations and the variables that can affect a business, whether that's weather, whether that's sales cycles, whatever that might be. We need to be able to see all the different variables. So as a guide, we tend to allow for a full year, and we want to see a full year. And also, it's nice if we were sat here now in 2019, so what are we now, in April 2019, if you were presenting me with a baseline of 2018, I would be quite unhappy with that, because what we also then need to see is at least one clear year between the baseline and where we are now, so that you can start to demonstrate this continual improvement. Now, one of the questions I got asked, and I'll probably start with it here, I'm conscious we are going to go over, by the way, just a bit of a warning, we are going to go over time. If you want to drop out at 2 o'clock, please do so. Don't let me hold you. I have gone on far too long, but it's good because we've had some quite good questions, actually. You won't miss anything, as I say, because we are recording this, and you can then go on and pick up from where you left off if you do have to leave at 2 o'clock. So the question I got asked is it continual improvement against the baseline, or is it continual improvement sort of continually, if that makes sense? I tend to look to see that continual improvement is initially measured against the baseline, yes. So that's where we're starting out from, and we're starting out from a set point. And if you're plotting it on a graph, your baseline would be the bottom of the graph. And what we would want to see is performance improving continually year on year against that baseline. And now, the question that I think is what's behind the question is, let's say you've set 2015 of your baseline, and you've improved in 2016, you've improved in 2017, but in 2018 you've had a bit of a dip in performance. So you've actually got worse than you were the previous year, but you still improved from your baseline. I think that would be really in breach of the definition of continual improvement, because continual is asking for sort of ongoing improvements. What we tend to do when we're assessing, we tend to look at each issue in its own right. So if you're presenting that type of a graph that's got a bit of a dip, we would obviously want to know why. We would want you to know why, because it's one of the things you have to look at under monitoring and measurement. If you're not achieving the expected performance, you have to be able to say why. But I would really, hand on heart, expect to see continual improvement year on year, not just against the baseline, because to be honest, you could have a really cracking year in, so 2016, you've got your baseline, 2017, you've got a really good cracking year. But then you could have 5 years of your performance getting worse, but you're still in a position better than the baseline. And I don't think that is really within the spirit of the standard. So generally, I would say continual improvement on a year-on-year basis. But the baseline, and a way of getting around that in a way, if things change, if the static factors change, as we talked about, then you need to go back and reevaluate your baseline. So baselines to me were always a fixed point in time, but the standard now talks about a movable baseline, and the baseline needs to be revised if we find that performance indicators no longer reflect the energy performance, there's been major changes to the static factors, or according to maybe a predetermined method, you might look at it every 5 years, say. So what that's effectively saying is, if you've changed all your lighting, ripped out all your old lighting and put in LED lighting across the entire premises, what would your baseline have looked like if you'd have had that LED lighting back in 2016, say, when the baseline was created? That's what it's all about in terms of a movable baseline. I said there was a lot more planning within the standard. You're right, a dip could be because of bad weather. Now, if a dip was because of bad weather, I would argue that the variables that you've taken into account, you may have come across degree days. So a dip in the weather or a variable. So last year, for instance, a lot of my clients were panicking because the summer was so hot. Not that I'm complaining, but a lot of people were throwing energy at air conditioning units and refrigeration units and things. But if they took the weather into account, so use degree days, so therefore the weather was, I don't know, so many percent hotter than normal, has our energy performance changed by that same percentage? So this is why we have to, at the start, work out what the variables are. And if the variables are the weather, we need to take that into account. And if you like, normalize those figures so that the variables can be ironed out and we can see the true performance. So if you came to me saying a dip in weather has caused us to reduce our energy performance, you'd find that you were getting a non-conformance from me because your performance indicators would not have taken into account those key variables. I hope that answers your question, Derek. What about demonstrating improvement of a continual 24-month period? Well, 24 months, 36 months, 48 months, I don't know. Again, we tend to take things on a case-by-case basis. If you're putting that to me, Dan, in an audit, I would want to talk to you about that and look at it on a case-by-case. I can't give you a definite yes, can't give you a definite no. I would be very unhappy about going above a 24-month period. I think that's, again, getting outside the spirit of the standard, really. Continual means sort of not ceasing. I'm not going to get into the argument of continuous versus continual, but continual improvement tends to indicate that we expect to see the graph with an upward trend. That's all I'll say at this point. So again, planning for data collection, we need to decide what we're going to plan. What's the data that we need to ascertain? How do we get that data? Do we need to start thinking about new metering? Do we need sub-metering? Have we got the right measuring equipment? Do we need to get in any external outside support, etc., etc.? So that's what the planning is all about. Now, we have spoken a lot. I've spoken a lot. It's 4 minutes to 2, so I've only 4 minutes left to get through another 20 slides. As I say, it's because of the questions, and I'm not knocking that because that's great. The questions sometimes are the best. But as I said, if anybody wishes to leave in the next 5 minutes, please do so. I'll thank you now for your attendance if you are leaving, but please go back and have a listen to the remainder of the slide, the presentation. It'll be up on YouTube probably sometime early next week. So competency hasn't really changed from the old standard. We have to determine the competency requirements of people working under our control, make sure that people are competent on the basis of education, training or experience. And if people haven't got the necessary competence, we need to allow them to ascertain it, to get that. Awareness, very similar. People doing work under our control, including contractors, therefore, are aware of the policy, how their work can affect our energy performance, how they can contribute to our energy performance, and the implications of not conforming. Communication, again, a process on who we're going to communicate with, how, when, why, what we're going to communicate. This harks right the way back to clause 4.2. Needs of interested parties. What do those interested parties want? And this is all about how do we give that to them, in what format, and how do we ensure that the communication, input and feedback is available. There is a requirement that there is a mechanism within the business to enable input and feedback on energy performance and on the system itself, be that a suggestion scheme, be that people feeding into the energy management team, it doesn't really matter, but there has to be a feedback mechanism. Documented information, again, based on the 2011 version, documentation, control of documents and records. We have to create and maintain sufficient documented information in order to demonstrate we have a suitable, adequate and effective ENMS. You can have what you like. The standard isn't very prescriptive other than in a small number of areas, which is on the next slide. Doesn't have to be a manual. You can set things out now how you like. I see a lot of companies now running flow charts instead of procedures, process control diagrams, things like that. That's quite acceptable. Sad that I am, I've been through the standard, and this slide, which is well worth printing off and keeping, tells you, as far as I'm aware, and I don't think I've missed anything, every part of the standard that says you must hold documented information. Now, the standard doesn't use the term documents and records anymore. I've kept it like that because I think we know what we mean by documents and records. The standard calls everything documented information. But if coming up to an audit, you can tick every single one of those boxes on that chart, that will give you all of the requirements of the standard in terms of documented information. Plus, then there's a safety net at the bottom that says any other things that you might deem necessary. Right, 2 o'clock. So anybody leaving, goodbye. I'll be going on for about another 10-15 minutes unless I get swamped by questions. Operational planning and control. This builds on what we did at clause 6. Clause 6 being planning. So this is now establishing those process controls that we need to achieve the objectives. We need to ensure that we're managing our processes properly and ultimately we're achieving continual improvement. So we need to make sure that anything we've identified as a significant energy use is managed, the energy usage is managed, it's controlled, and we detail how those controls are in place. We need to establish criteria for the operation of the process so that we make sure that people know what they're doing and communicate that criteria to those people that need to be aware of it. So we need to establish processes to set up, if you like, operating criteria for how we run things, how we maintain facilities, equipment, systems, how we plan changes. So if we're going to change things, if we're going to look at putting a new process in, or if we're going to run something new through the oven, how do we go about that to make sure that we're doing that in as an energy efficient way as we can? We need to make sure that we're planning changes and also have things in place to be able to control unintended changes. So unintended changes might be the weather last year. What can we do about something that's really, really hot? And how can we make sure that we manage that in an efficient way? And also to ensure that outsourced processes, these are processes that are still within our system, still within our scope rather, but are not fully managed by ourselves. So outsourced processes is another slight issue, but it's something where maybe somebody else has the responsibility for managing the energy or processes relating to our scope. Design and procurement, which is the next slide, go hand in hand. They haven't changed at all from the previous version. If we're designing new processes, if we're procuring new equipment, new items that can have a significant impact on energy usage, we have to make sure that the energy impact of that is assessed. And certainly for procurement, we have to communicate specifications to our suppliers to make sure that they are aware that we will be evaluating the success or the suitability of their product from an energy performance specification, if you like. Clause 9, performance evaluation. We talked earlier about planning for performance evaluation, measuring what we're going to be doing. We have to monitor, measure, and analyze our energy performance, including that of the system itself. So we need to decide, and we've already looked at this earlier at clause 6, what do we need to monitor? So what methods are we going to use to ensure that we have valid results? Do we need to have calibrated or externally verified equipment, for example? What criteria are we going to set? How do we measure our energy usage? How do we measure our energy performance? If we're running a fleet of vehicles, do we monitor literally just how much diesel is put in the cars, the vehicles? Do we measure fuel consumption? Do we measure fuel consumption against individual drivers, etc., etc.? What are we going to actually use to carry out this? And what are the indicators? Miles per gallon is an ENPI because it's an amount of fuel against another variable. So miles per gallon is a very good ENPI. When are we going to carry out this monitoring? How often do we need to do it? How are we going to analyze the results? And then do we need to, if yes we do, I guess, communicate the results internally and retain documented information. Interestingly, although there isn't a clause on compliance, there is a clause on evaluation of compliance. So this is just the same as the other standards. We have to evaluate our compliance with legal and other requirements. So in other words, if we're required by law to do something or prevented from doing something, are we complying with that? And we need to evaluate our compliance status and take actions if need be. We can use a variety of different methods. We need to retain documentation regarding this, but it can be done in a number of ways. It can be done via audit, it can be done by a documentation review, which would say be a review of bills. It can be done by site tour, routine day-to-day monitoring. But who's going to do it? Who's suitable? How do we do it? And what records are we keeping? And it applies to all. It applies rather to all legal and other requirements. Excuse me. Internal audit, gloss over this. I think we know what internal audits are. No additional requirements, change of clause number, but it's just the same as always was, same as any of the other standards. We have to conduct internal audits, we have to establish an audit program, and we have to look at, within the audits, evaluating performance improvements, our policy commitments, objectives, targets, and also look at the results of previous audits. Management review, again, hasn't changed. It's got a new clause number. That's a list of the inputs to the management review, and that's a list of the outputs. Basically, management review is a process. I know we all talk about management review meetings. You'll not see the word meeting anywhere in the standard. And as I said earlier, the requirement to forecast forward-looking energy performance has been dropped from the review and is now included within the energy review. So that's just a checklist of things you need to cover within the management review. And then finally, improvement. Quite an interesting clause now, because there is this requirement for continually improving our energy performance, and that is clause 10.2. So the standard requires that we continually improve our energy performance. We did touch a little bit earlier on, was it against the baseline or is it year on year? Again, somebody's asked a question. This is the third time I've said this now. Can the slide be sent through mails for reference purposes? Yes, you can. You'll get the whole process. If you want to cut and paste anything out of this and use it for reference purposes, of course you can. All this material that I'm using is freely available. So if you want to use that slide and cut and paste that into something else, by all means, go ahead and do that, quite happy. So continual improvement now has its own clause. Clause 10.2 is continual improvement. And if you are not continually improving your energy performance, you will be in breach of clause 10.2. And being in breach of a clause of a standard results in a major non-conformance. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about ISO 50003. It doesn't apply to you, it applies to us. But one of the things that ISO 50003 brought out was this requirement for how we plan audits and to make sure that we're doing what we're doing and that we're doing it properly, that we allocate sufficient time to audits, but also sets out a few individual requirements for 50001 assessing. The thing that caused a bit of issue was this phrase, energy performance improvement. So I'll read from the slide. Improvement in measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, or energy consumption compared to the energy baseline. Now that's the question that was asked earlier, and that's what 50003 defines it as. It's compared to the energy baseline. However, a major non-conformity now includes audit evidence that energy performance was not improved. Now, the standard talks about continual improvement in energy performance. So you could argue it slightly contradicts itself, but as we said earlier, what I believe the intention of the standard is that we are continually improving on a year-on-year basis. Not that we have a huge improvement in year one, which takes us, I don't know, 20% better than our baseline. But then over the next 10 years, we're actually starting to gradually decrease again, but we're still above our baseline. That to me is not within the spirit of the standard. So this was the issue, but now, of course, in the new standard, continual improvement has its own flaws. So therefore, this is what this old standard said, 50,003 said that energy performance improvement is a unique requirement for an ENMS. Auditors for assessment bodies must consider energy performance improvement as a part of the certification decision. And it gives some examples. Total energy consumption decreases over time, or total energy consumption increases, but the measure of energy performance defined by the organisation improves. So that's an EMPI measure. So for instance, you could say that your energy usage has gone up by 10%, but your sales have gone up by 20%. So therefore, that's actually a good improvement in energy performance. So the transition process, as I said, I do need to change the dates in this. We're now talking about the 22nd of August. We've had that clarified by UCAS. So the changes to the standard are deemed significant. We will perform what we call value-added assessments. So we're not with you just to do a tick box exercise. We are with you to make sure that your management system gives you what you're wanting from it and is there to achieve continual improvement. We're not allowed to offer consultancy. We can't do that, but we can help you, we can guide you, we can point you in the right direction. All 50,001 2011 certificates will expire on the 22nd of August, if you want to just make a note of that, 22nd of August now 2021. And there's three ways of transitioning. You can either transition at a reassessment, and that's what we're recommending people do. You can transition at a surveillance visit, or you can transition at any time. Now, the point that I made earlier, we have to receive UCAS accreditation before we can issue certificates. We had our visit yesterday, and we got through with no negative findings at all, with a clean bill of health, so we're just waiting for formal notification from UCAS, and then we'll be open for business. We can do pre-assessments. I know with some of the other transitions we did do that. We had a couple of companies who asked us to go in and do a pre-assessment, and that's quite possible. And if you want to do that, either speak to your normal assessor or speak to NQA sales. So prior to the transition assessment, so when you decide you're going to transition, and unlike, and I will mention them now, LRQA, we're not insisting on people transitioning just yet. We will let you stick with the old standard through to probably early 2021. But prior to, once you've told us you were to transition, about a month before the audit, you'll be contacted by your assessor, and you will be sent a copy of our gap analysis document. We will also require you to have completed an internal audit and also carried out a management review. So just to summarise, and I do apologise, we've gone 15 minutes over, but I think it's been worthwhile. I hope you'll agree it's been worthwhile. So the new standard more or less adopts the Annex SL high-level structure and tries to be compatible with the other management system standards. The new standard has clarified the terminology around energy review. It's given a little bit more guidance on the normalization of performance indicators and the associated ENB. I didn't mention that in the slides, but ENB is just the energy baseline. A little bit of clarification on the energy data collection planning. So that planning process for data collection has been revised and been strengthened. And then, as I say, the performance indicator and baseline text has been clarified to provide a better understanding of these concepts. Basically, all that has happened, it has taken the old standard and put it into the Annex SL format with some clarification of some of the terminology. So other than the bits around context, needs of interested parties and leadership, from a technical perspective, from a hard-on energy management perspective, there are no new requirements, just a strengthening of some of them, and as I say, the bringing in the Annex SL bits. So where next? We suggest if you already have a management system in place, an energy management system in place, you take a fresh look at it. Have a look at our website. There's a lot of information on there. I've written a huge amount of stuff. We produce something called NQA in Touch, which comes out once a month with various blogs and articles. I write quite extensively within that on both energy and environmental management. There's a transition guide, which goes through a lot of the stuff that's in this presentation and looks at the background to the standard and what you need to carry out. But highlight the key changes as opportunities for improvement. See them as something that's going to be beneficial. Make changes to your documentation to reflect the new structure. Make sure you've implemented the new requirements on leadership, risk, and context. Review the effectiveness of your current controls and do that with a view that every control might have to be changed. And then finally, carry out the gap analysis on our form TR006, which will be sent out to NQA clients. So we've got to the very end with only 15 minutes over. As I said right at the start, the presentation will be emailed to you as a PDF file. I don't send it out as a PowerPoint file. As a PDF file within 5 working days. You will also get a link to a recording of this presentation. A lot of questions. It's been really good, so thank you guys for that. This has probably been the presentation I've done that's been the most interactive with the most questions. It's really good, is that. Downside is it just takes us a little bit over. So thank you very much for your time. One last call for questions before we sign off. But as I say, you will get contacted by NQA fairly shortly with the information I've said. Just a reminder, you can get hold of me. I don't mind answering individual questions. If you suddenly decide there's something you'd like to know a little bit more about, send us an email. So it's richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh @nqa.com. No more questions coming, so I thank you for your time. And what is it, Friday afternoon, so have a good weekend, and I'm sure we'll speak again at some point in the near future. Thank you very much and goodbye.